I think it's a pretty big distinction that very often gets lost.
Do you think now adaptation obviously happens over a long period of time? Do you think we're going to see any species that physically and behaviorally adapt to humanity? If we look at one case in, say, the domestic dog, I guess they started off as a wolf and then they decided that they could get an easier feed hanging out with us.
We're already seeing it. There are certain species of mountain goats, and that because trophy hunters want, these big presentable horns, there's already been a strong selection to have small horns. So the average size of the male's horns, which would usually be there to compete for mates, is shrinking because the risk of getting killed and being removed from population having the bigger horns is so detrimental that it's better to lose a little bit of your ability to attract a mate than just be removed from the population completely. So you have things like that. You have things like elephants change their behavior based on where humans are. I mean, you're starting to see, even in very short periods of time, adaptation to things we're doing where they can. I mean, the problem is that usually these adaptations take a long time to develop. And so you probably, the pressure you put on things, like, if you pour mercury into a river, and the animals don't have time to adapt to that. It's just too much of a acute shock into the environment that they just don't have time. But if it's a milder thing like hunting pressure, where not every single individual who could be hunted will be, it gives them enough time and it can go pretty quickly. They can start to adapt to these human pressures. And you'll see things like that. And even historically, without human pressure, animals that end up on islands if they're large, tend to shrink. So you had these pygmy elephants in Cyprus and places like that, which were the size of ponies, basically. So even in the short term, animals can adapt. It's just that a lot of things that we do outstrip their ability to adapt.
This is a real opinion question here, but when you look at humanity and the modern trends, and then you look at us as like the part beast of the forest kind of style, do you look at those the trends that are happening and feel like we're going backwards as a species that used to roam around, or how do you feel about that personally?
How do you mean backwards?
We seem to be, I think if you took like a modern human and put it in the forest, it probably wouldn't fare so well. I mean, I did just see The Revenant and that guy didn't go so well, but I feel like a modern human would probably be worse. It'd be pretty quick to get it gobbled up or something.
Well, I think the issue is we're at risk of going backwards very quickly because a lot of the things that we do are not sustainable. So the kind of energy and consumption, water scarcity, which affects about 4 billion people, resource scarcity means that some of the advances we've made in ways that we live based on those advancements may come crashing to a halt. And also the way we use and abuse biodiversity, basically making it less and less diverse, could have unforeseen consequences. If there's something out there we desperately need and we kill it off, it's not going to be something we can replace. You also just even thinking about climate change, regardless of whether you're someone who believes it's human caused or not, climate change is happening, and it could also lead to either diminishing or end of the way we live. And the idea that just we'll figure it out when we get there because scientists will manage is not really a very good bet. And so there are a lot of things that people, humans as a species, have placed bets on non-renewable resources that may have huge consequences in the near future. So in that regard, I don't say we're going backwards, but we could. And quickly. We can end up throwing ourselves back into the Bronze Age if you imagine suddenly we couldn't produce electricity anymore, or there was no more fuel. I think you would see that society would change drastically and very quickly.
I was watching on the Black Friday sales where they have $200 off TVs and things like that. And yeah, we saw like humans basically trampling each other. So if they go back into the place where like exactly you said, water scarcity or food scarcity, I mean, it's going to be an interesting time. And I guess that's really going to be survival of the fittest.
I think water scarcity is going to be the first major problem because it already is around 4 billion people are already affected by this. So you're looking at almost half the planet dealing with severe water scarcity. And it will probably become much more of a top agenda issue as soon as it gets more noticeable in the developed world, which it's already started a little bit. There were these immense water shortages in California recently where people weren't allowed to water their lawns and do things that they were used to doing. And you immediately can see how problematic that becomes. And that's just the beginning of these types of problems. And of course, since everything else depends on water, it'll have effects throughout the entire world ecosystem.
Now, do you see relationships between creatures? Is that one of the things that you look at, relationships between creatures that currently exist and sort of their cousins, their ancient cousins? And do you draw, I saw you had a recent paper, Evolutionary Relationships Among Extinct and Extinct Sloths.
Right.
So is that part of the compare contrast? What take us through that process?
Well, the issue with a lot of the ancient DNA stuff we've done or is being done right now is very often you'll have a bone or you might even have a complete skeleton, and you'll look at all the morphological features and not really be able to come to a conclusion about what the animal actually was. You might be able to say this was some kind of ancient sloth, but what kind? Like, is it like a two-toed sloth or a three-toed sloth or some other type of extinct sloth? And when there was no DNA analysis, then you just kind of argued it based on morphology, but you were stuck. And then what we started to see when we looked at DNA is that a lot of things we had assumed about relationships of different species were not true. Not always, but sometimes pretty spectacularly. Even with humans, we're now finding all these different species of humans that coexisted with us even 10, 20,000 years ago. Not just Neanderthals, but all these other human species. And so we try to get DNA and look at these types of relationships. So in the case of the sloths, for example, there were some morphological studies that would have suggested that the small tree sloths that exist today should be closely affiliated because they're morphologically similar. They have the same body size or relatively similar body size. But then it turns out the two-toed sloths you would find in places like Costa Rica are actually much more like these absolutely enormous ground sloths, mylodons that lived 10,000 years ago in places like Chile. And the three-toed sloths are more like these bear-like size sloths that lived in Central America and the southwest of the United States. So you kind of throw that off. And then we also looked at how viruses that were in them were evolving. And we can see that it doesn't really follow what the sloths were doing. It's more like waves of infection that we couldn't see just looking at a bone, but we can start to trace back in time by looking at ancient DNA.
I feel like being a large ground-dwelling sloth is probably not going to be the best recipe for success.
Yeah, these things were gigantic. They were bigger than elephants. There are two groups that had there was Megatherium and Mylodon were these just colossal sloths, and then the others were more bear-like size. Still pretty big when you consider that a living sloth is not very big.
And super friendly. They've evolved friendliness. I don't know. What got you into this? I mean, you look at all these marvelous creatures and you deal with some of the kind of the coolest, the classical coolest like the mammoths, etc. What got you into how'd you fall into this sort of line of work?
A lot of it just random, following things around. But I originally started from a more medical angle and also from looking at viruses. But since I'd worked on mammoths years ago as a postdoc, I was interested in the idea that from things we were seeing that the things we observe today may be very recent or not very reflective of the recent past. And for me, that extends to diseases. And so I started getting very interested in trying to merge disease research with ancient DNA to see if things that we're concerned about now are old, recent, young, have always been there, have made some big change. Sort of the kind of things that I can't really do if I just look at what's out there right now. Mm-hmm. So I spend most of my time looking at what's out there right now because for most things we don't know. But for specific things where we have a pretty good idea of what's going on today, like koalas, it's very interesting to go back back in time and see what was happening in koalas in the recent history, and the project we're doing now looking at 10,000-year-old koalas to see what their infection history looked like much longer ago.
Yeah, I think it's by the sound. Well, obviously I'm located in Australia, so it sounds like you need to do a trip down here because we've got lots of stuff that you want to work on.
I was there last year. I have an Australian student, and I have people bouncing back and forth in Australia and Germany.
Yeah, I guess because it's such a unique environment down here, and so separate for a long time that we sort of developed some interesting creatures, lots of which are deadly, but it's mostly a nice place.
Well, the koala's not so deadly, so I can focus on that.
I heard they can be bad-tempered.
They do bite, but they don't poison you.
No, that's the one evolutionary trait that's probably my least favorite, the poisoning ability.
Well, the crocodiles are also not so, biting isn't so great either.
That's true.
But yeah, the poison animal prevalence in Australia is quite amazing.
Was that something you worried about coming down? I mean, you know the facts. You know how everything got here. When you step into a place like that, you look at it a little differently from the usual tourist.
I probably wouldn't want to run around barefoot in shorts in places where there's like funnel spiders and other things running, or where the snakes are. But we have projects in Africa, and those are also extremely dangerous because of the carnivores. And there's usually, except maybe for New Zealand, there's risks associated with most places. Because in New Zealand, there's pretty much nothing poisonous and nothing that bites.
Yeah.
So
just dodgy people. No, I'm just joking. We say that with affection as neighbors.
But it's exactly the opposite of Australia in terms of its animal.
If people want to find out more about your work, where's the best place to catch you? Are you active on social media? Is there?
There's ResearchGate. I'm not active in social media. My institute is ResearchGate. I usually post papers as they come out, and there are some forums there for discussion, or through our press releases and our press office here. But ResearchGate's probably the best place because that's where you get to the papers and good stuff. And because directly contacting me is not always so easy because I'm usually somewhere else.
Well, we hope you wish you all the best on your travels. And Professor Alex Greenwood, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Take care.
Nice talking to you.
And that's about all we have time for this, the second show of the Univ podcast. We hope to continue to bring you more interesting people to talk to in a variety of fields. We shall see you next time for the next installment of the Univ podcast.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you for listening to the Univ podcast. To follow our series, please subscribe to our channel via iTunes, Beyond Pod, or the equivalent service. And if you particularly enjoyed the show, please don't forget to rate. For further information, news, videos, and articles, head to univ.com.au.